Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event on the US elections and the implication for international security. We have, needless to say, an incredible opportunity to discuss probably or arguably one of the most important elections in the world. And in order to do that today, we have incredibly very important world-leading experts on the topic. But obviously, before I hand it over to them, let me start off by thanking the School of Security Studies at King's College London, and by greeting our students from the Defence Academy of the United Kingdom, our students in Central London, War Studies, MA students, PhD students, and our guests from all over the world. Before I also hand it over to my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Zeno Leoni, who's going to introduce the topic and introduce each speaker one by one. Let me just specify very briefly, then we're going to be having Professor Ken Schultz from Stanford University. Then we're going to be having Dr. Morgan Kaplan from Harvard University, and then our colleagues from KCL, Freedman, Ruth Diamond, and Leila Talani, who will be offering the more European perspective on this. Without any further ado, once again, welcome all, and thank you very much. Zeno, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michele. Welcome everyone. This has been a very unique year for US politics because of the electoral campaign, because of COVID-19, and we have witnessed three very heated debates, probably the most heated in many, many years. Certainly the most heated I can remember. Obviously, domestic politics is always a big issue in this kind of competitions, especially we know that in the United States. There are also many open questions with regard to the future of US foreign policy and its implications for international security. I believe during today's question, we're going to hear about several important issues, such as the future of US foreign policy towards China, Russia, NATO allies, the EU, multilateral institutions, but also, of course, the Middle East. But also, I think a critical issue, which will be mentioned by our guests, is should we expect more change or more continuity in case of a Biden's victory? And should Trump win the election, how different will it be compared to Trump's first mandate as a president of the United States? So without any further delay, I have the pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Ken Schultz from the Department of Political Science of Stanford University. Professor Schultz's research examines international conflict and conflict resolution with a particular focus on the domestic political influences on foreign policy choices. He's also the author of books such as Democracy and Coercive Diplomacy on the one hand, and War Politics, Interest, Interactions, and Institutions on the other hand. And the latter was co-written with David Lake and Jeffrey Freedman. Professor Schultz, thank you very much for joining us. the floor is yours for no more than 15 minutes. Thanks.
Great. Great, thank you so much. I'm really delighted and honored to be on this excellent panel, and I'm grateful to the organizers for putting this together and for inviting me. So I've been asked to talk about the consequences of the upcoming election through the lens of US domestic politics. And in doing so, I have to say I'm always mindful of the words of the great philosopher and baseball player Yogi Berra, who famously said that it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. And I'm particularly wary, realizing that if we had held this session a year ago or even 8 months ago, the word pandemic would probably not have even been uttered. And so that should remind us to be cautious about our confidence in making any predictions. Even so, we'll forge on. So I think the conventional thinking about the effect of elections on foreign policy might suggest that the re-election of the incumbent is likely to lead to continuity in a country's foreign policy, while replacement by a challenger creates potential for greater changes. But what I want to argue today is that the opposite is now true in American politics. US foreign policy is likely to experience bigger and more fundamental changes in a Trump second term than if Biden is elected. So that's the thesis I want to develop. But before I get into that and why that is, I do want to emphasize that I think there are a number of aspects of future US foreign policy that are likely already baked in, regardless of who wins the election. And just to suggest a few of these. So for example, the move away from the policy of engagement with China towards a more confrontational approach. This is a broad shift that has been in the works for some time and is likely to continue regardless of who wins the election, even if particulars of that policy might not be the same. I think it's also unlikely that we're going to see a return in the United States to a kind of a full-throated embrace of globalization and free trade. That was the hallmark of the first 2 decades in the post-Cold War period. That consensus also has been fraying for some time. Trump obviously was able to exploit discontent with trade in his first election, but his turn to economic nationalism also has echoes on the Democratic side of the aisle, where support for free trade has always been more tenuous. Right, so I think that there's likely to be kind of continuity in that regard. And then a final thing I would emphasize is the process of polarization of American politics. The fact that the positions of the parties are on a variety of issues have gotten farther apart, but also the high levels of rancor that exist between the parties. This is likely to continue regardless who wins. In fact, it's likely to accelerate regardless of the outcome, because the losing side is unlikely to feel like it wants to play nice in the aftermath of this election. So there's a number of pathologies that are associated with polarization in terms of the diminished role of Congress in overseeing US foreign policy, greater divisiveness of public opinion, the potential instability of commitments from one administration to the next. And I think these pathologies are going to continue. This is not dependent on who wins. Okay, so those are some areas of likely continuity post-election, and I'm sure we could identify more. So what changes? What changes? So as I said, I think the potential for fundamental changes is greater if Trump is reelected than if Biden wins. So I want to build out that case, and there's kind of really just three main points that I want to make to support that idea. The first point is a recognition of the constraints that Trump has operated within in his first term. So I think, for all the rhetoric and bombast of his administration, Trump didn't really radically reshape US foreign policy in his first term. Sure, there were certain specific departures from Obama policies. We could particularly point to climate change. We could point to the approach towards Iran and the Iran nuclear deal. We've certainly seen a lot more hard bargaining with allies, although issues of burden sharing are longstanding in American alliances and weren't created by Trump. We've seen heated up rhetoric in the trade war with China. But overall, I think Trump's bark has been worse than his bite with respect to China. And as I said, just already suggested, there's likely to be greater emphasis on competition with China that was coming anyway. We've seen some departures from international agreements, but wild threats such as to leave NATO or to pull out of the WTO or to withdraw troops from places like South Korea, these haven't really been followed through on. So why have the changes so far under Trump not lived up to the rhetoric? Well, some of it is that it may have just been rhetoric, but it's also the case that he's faced a number of constraints in his first term, and two constraints in particular to highlight. The first has been the resistance of key advisors and cabinet officials, particularly resistance in the military, which at a number of moments have blunted or slowed down his initiatives. And the second constraint has been re-election concerns. Trump has been very much focused on what it takes to get reelected, and I do think that this has shaped some foreign policy decisions, perhaps added a degree of caution that would not otherwise be there. So he's of course been very sensitive about allegations of collusion with Russia, which I think has stayed his hand with respect to some things he might want to do there. I think it's also interesting that he went to the brink on several occasions with Iran, but then pulled back. And it's hard to know if that's just Trump or if he was wary of starting a conflict in his first term, especially when he was hoping to run on a platform of having ended America's entanglements in the Middle East. So what I think is the thing is that in the second term, we'll likely see Trump unbound by these prior constraints. He has been gradually replacing experienced advisors who kind of come out of more older traditions of U.S. foreign policy. He's been replacing them with political loyalists and yes men who are less likely to contradict him or slow him down. And of course, in the second term, his re-election concerns will no longer be there, which will give him greater freedom to do risky things that he might not have contemplated before. All right, so this is really the first main point, that a Trump without guardrails is freer to be what he wants to be, which may be more extreme than he has been to this point. If nothing else, it's going to make U.S. foreign policy more subject to his whims, which, as we've seen, have been pretty unpredictable. Okay, the second point I want to make on this is that a Trump victory would almost certainly complete the transformation of the Republican Party into a nationalist party. And particularly when it comes to foreign policy. So the Republican Party has long seen tension between an internationalist wing that was committed to an active U.S. role in the world and to U.S. global leadership, and a nationalist wing that is significantly more isolationist and less interested in kind of the aspects of leadership. For much of the Cold War and even after, the internationalist side of that party has been relatively strong. And the Republican Party has long been a major force for an active US role in the world. I think a second Trump term likely completes the victory of the nationalists and casts out the internationalists. So US foreign, what we would see as a result of that is a US foreign policy that is even more transactional, less interested in providing collective goods, less interested in providing leadership of post-war institutions that have been an important feature of America's global commitment since World War II. With respect to US promotion of democracy and human rights, well, of course, we have to be realistic here. There's always been a gap between rhetoric and practice, but it's likely we're going to see, we would see a US even less interested in promoting these things, particularly with the acceleration of democratic erosion within the United States itself. So by contrast, a sound Trump defeat could put the future of the Republican Party up for grabs and create space for a return of the internationalist wing. Now, there's no guarantee that that's going to happen, but an electoral repudiation of Trumpism seems like a necessary ingredient. Okay, so then the third and final point that I want to make here is that President Biden, if we get a President Biden, he is likely to be what I would call a restorationist president, back in many ways to an Obama-style foreign policy, which was, broadly speaking, U.S. leadership, but with a greater emphasis on multilateralism and spreading the burden. Of course, we would see some clear reversals relative to Trump. Biden would be likely to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, for example, maybe start talking to Iran again and get about the potential of Iran deal too. But I think the important consideration for Biden is that his first year and beyond is likely to be consumed with domestic issues, primarily what it takes to recover from the pandemic, economic recovery. If he is elected with significant majorities in Congress, Democratic majorities in Congress, he's going to be under a great deal of pressure to enact major domestic reforms on healthcare, on voting rights, possibly court reform. So, presidents in their first year rarely undertake major overhauls of foreign policy because it's not what they want to spend their time and their political capital on. It's not why they were elected and not usually what they primarily wanted to do. And I think this will be particularly true of the White House that Biden would enter. So yes, there's likely to be an immediate change of tone towards allies in Europe and in East Asia, likely to be a change in tone towards adversaries like Russia, but less likely to see major new initiatives early on. I think the open question from my perspective, and which I'd love to hear our European interlocutors here address, is whether a Biden presidency can really restore America's previous place at the center of so many international institutions and partnerships. Is the country that elected George W. Bush and then Donald Trump a country that Europeans will want to closely re-embrace? Or has this experience set in motion a process of rethinking that is likely to prevent any kind of restoration of America's previous role in the world? So I'll stop with that question, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Schultz, for unpacking the domestic dynamics behind US foreign policy. I don't intend to take time away from our panelists, nor from the audience. Therefore, I'm going to introduce with great pleasure our next speaker, Dr. Morgan Kaplan, who is the executive editor of the quarterly journal International Security, and who also covers other prestigious editorial assignments within the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Kaplan's research examines the international politics of rebellion with a focus on how opposition groups use diplomacy to solicit third-party support. Dr. Kaplan, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours for no more than 15 minutes. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers who put together such an incredible panel, and to King's College for bringing us all together before this election. I was asked to speak about US foreign policy in the Middle East and what the potential impact of the various potential outcomes of this election could be on international security in the Middle East, and particularly US foreign policy. And so I'll start my comments mostly by focusing on what a potential Biden administration, how that may affect US relations and politics in the region. And partially that's because we've had 4 years of Trump. We have a general sense of how he behaves on the international arena, but also because he's generally a wild card. So it actually is kind of hard to make any sort of predictions on that front, although I agree a lot with what Professor Schultz had said in terms of what he may or may not be able to do in a second term. And of course, I also want to start with the same kind of caveat, which is, we really are talking in the hypothetical here. Hypothetical for two reasons. One, we truly have no idea who's going to win this election, regardless of the polls. It's hard for anyone to really put their finger on the pulse of what the outcome is going to be. And second, because we also know that even candidates with stated and explicit foreign policies can have those foreign policies change once they're in the administration, depending on what constraints there are domestically, but also different perspectives from different acts that are unpredicted. Professor Schultz brought up the pandemic, but you can go back to the example of George W. Bush, who spent much of his first campaign railing against nation building, and then ultimately kind of became the nation builder in chief after 9/11. So there's a lot of hypothetical here, but nonetheless, I'm going to try and unpack what I think are some potential trends in changes we can see in U.S. foreign policy in the region. So the first potential thing we could see in a hypothetical Biden administration is there has been this emphasis, particularly within thinking about the Middle East, on a further withdrawal or drawdown of America's military presence in the region. Now, the thing is that this is actually a policy that seems to actually be bipartisan in the United States. There's a general exhaustion of the concept of forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But what's interesting about Biden's proposal and the way he's talked about it is there is this little caveat, which is there is this expectation that there will be withdrawal, but there's this emphasis on the use of special forces, having a light footprint in the Middle East to basically go back to sort of an Obama-style counterterrorism, counterinsurgency platform in the region. The thing about that, right, is on the one hand, it sounds like it may be entering a bit more of a period of restraint when it comes to the use of force in U.S. foreign policy internationally. But on the other hand, we know that even a light footprint, a buy with through approach with regional allies actually has wide variation for how much of an impact or how much influence the U.S. is going to have in the area, and also how much it's going to partake militarily. And so, even 1 foot on the ground, or even your toe on the ground could eventually quickly lead to your whole head underwater. So there is a little bit of there's a little bit of tension between this idea that we can expect potentially in a Biden administration to want to focus less on a strong military presence in the Middle East, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. is going to start becoming uninvolved. And of course, this is influenced by this kind of bipartisan look towards a pivot to Asia. The second thing that I think is important, and Professor Schultz spoke about this a bit, is it seems clear that under a hypothetical Biden administration, what we would see is a change in rhetoric from the United States in how it approaches the region. And the particular rhetoric we're talking about here, of course, is human rights and pro-democracy rhetoric. Now, of course, right, rhetoric is just rhetoric. I do not think the Democratic Party wants to go down the road of strong, active promotion of democracy abroad. And as Professor Schultz noted, right, I mean, there's always been a tremendous amount of distance between how the United States speaks rhetorically about liberalism and human rights and how it behaves and when it moves. But nonetheless, I think the rhetoric is going to impact relations to a degree that will be noticeable. And why is that the case? There's a few reasons. I mean, one, and this goes both towards how the U.S. engages with both allies and adversaries in the region. For the last 4 years, there's been a complete absence of U.S. liberal rhetoric in the region. What that's done is it basically means that both allies and adversaries who violate human rights have a bit more certainty that the U.S. isn't going to do something if they violate certain norms and it takes certain actions. However, the reintroduction of rhetoric brings in, I think, and this is just a hypothesis, it brings back in a level of uncertainty that the U.S. may act, may impose sanctions, may do something that makes maybe some states or some actors who before wouldn't think twice because they know the U.S. is checked out from a rhetorical standpoint to say, but what if they do something, right? I mean, they've been talking a lot about it lately, and that may actually change behavior. Second, for better or worse, rhetoric matters a lot for opposition movements in the region, right? When the U.S. is not talking about liberalism and democracy and support for human rights, it's clear to everyone that the U.S. is not going to involve itself, right? I mean, look at Belarus right now. But when people hear the rhetoric, it does lead to a sense, and by the way, sometimes dangerously a false sense, that the U.S. is paying attention and it may support opposition movements. And so both, in terms of how it'll affect state behavior and how it'll affect, opposition in social movements in the region, I do think the reintroduction of rhetoric is going to make a difference and is going to matter, right? I mean, you can think of hypothetical scenarios where it could have mattered in the last 4 years. The murder of Khashoggi, right? There was no response from the United States. And the question is, perhaps Saudi Arabia would have still carried out the killing, but, there would have been perhaps more of a response, and that may have led to some other alternative behavior, right? Back to human rights issues in the war in Yemen, Syria, and so on. Now, the two other types of trends that I think may change have to do not necessarily with policy goals, but with policy process. Processes that have changed a bit in the last 4 years under the Trump administration, and we could probably see maybe a restoration back in the next 4 years. And that has to do with relations between the White House and the Department of Defense and the White House and the State Department. And these matter greatly for how the US behaves in the region. And I'll start, with looking at the defense, White House, civil military relations perspective on this. Why is this important? There's been a general sense over the last 4 years, right, that this is an interesting relationship where in some ways, President Trump has given the Department of Defense a very long leash, right? Do whatever you can, defeat ISIS. There's not a lot of nitty-gritty oversight over what the Department of Defense is doing, right? And so what's happened is on the one hand, you have this kind of department that's going and doing what it thinks it's best for US foreign policy with a little bit less of what seems to be civilian oversight. But there's also the issue that Donald Trump is still the commander in chief. And so when he acts, it often seems to take place without consultation of those in the Pentagon. And it leads to a lot of dangerous scenarios where you get a lot of uncertainty, right? I mean, case in point in one of these is the Syrian withdrawal, or I should say partial withdrawal. This caught American troops completely off ground in northeast Syria. And it led to a lot of confusion, right? Even on the ground and how the US should behave. And it created an environment that was actually quite dangerous. It created a lot of tension between the Pentagon and the White House. Another example is the killing of Qasem Soleimani. This was something that, I've spoken with troops who were in Iraq at the time. It caught everyone off guard. And it leads to this weird world where the militarized side of US foreign policy is not actually coordinated very well. And that itself leads to a lot of potential for misperceptions, a lot of potential for quick actions that aren't thought out very well. And so what I'd imagine is that in a hypothetical Biden administration, you'd probably get a closer kind of relationship between the Department of Defense and the White House in the sense of there being actually more coordination. In terms of the State Department, it's the same thing. I mean, there's been a complete gutting of the State Department over the last 4 years. And this has had a huge effect on how our allies in the region deal with us. I mean, to take a case, again, looking from Iraq, you talk to people in Iraq, both Kurds and Arabs, and they talk about how difficult it is to deal with the United States because when you speak to someone from the State Department, it's not really clear whether that person is speaking on behalf of the Secretary of State, let alone the President of the United States. And therefore, if it doesn't come from a tweet from the White House, it's very hard to actually engage in relations and foreign policy with the United States. That's caused a lot of uncertainty, a lot of issues in the region. And so hypothetically, we could imagine that there may be a closer tightening of coordination between the State Department and the White House in a hypothetical administration. Now, in terms of kind of more specific areas and cases, this kind of builds on the point previously said, which is there's actually, I don't want to make it sound like a lot's going to change. There's a lot of things that either cannot be undone from what Donald Trump has done in his presidency. And if a Biden administration came in, they wouldn't necessarily want to roll it back because it's either difficult to do or doing so would actually be more costly than it would be beneficial. So for example, one of the biggest organizing principles of security in the region for the United States is nuclear proliferation, non-proliferation. And people talk about, a hypothetical Biden administration coming in and, re-entering the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. But I mean, there's a lot of reason to believe that may not be possible, or at least not be possible to re-enter the deal as it currently is, where everyone just says, oh boy, that was a rough 4 years, let's come back in. A lot has changed since then, both within Iran, in the United States, and within the region. And it's most likely that while a Biden administration would want to probably engage more with Iran to re-engage in some sort of deal, it'll probably have to be some sort of a new deal. And it may not mean that we're starting back at square one, but it means that there's no such thing as just turning on the light and we're going back. The US withdrawal from the JCPOA is something that has happened and is probably going to remain. until there's something new to replace it. Similarly, although I don't think, a Democratic Party probably would have shepherded the Abraham Accords the way that they have in terms of Israel's normalization of relations with the UAE and Bahrain, this is a reality for any incoming administration. Biden has already said that he has no intentions of moving the embassy in Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv. So there's a lot of things that aren't going to change. And of course, on the one hand, we talk about the withdrawal from Syria or in poor relations with Turkey, or the biggest NATO ally right now. But Biden himself doesn't have great relations with Turkey. And in fact, that kind of relationship may get even worse. And so the final point I kind of want to make, and that's to kind of build on what's previously been said, though, is right, a lot of, I think, what's going to happen in terms of US foreign policy in general has less to do with who wins the election than how the election is won and where we go from here. For those of you who are watching our politics here in the United States, closely, this is an extremely divided country with extreme polarization. There's racial, social, political tension. And that tension is both an opportunity for international actors to intervene in our own domestic politics, but it's also a distraction on the American public. Most of us are just generally kind of exhausted, as everyone is, from the pandemic, from the election. And that exhaustion means that there's less of a civic engagement in US foreign policy from the public than there normally would be. And what that means for foreign policy, I think, is really interesting, right? The fact that I turn on the news very frequently and I see nothing about foreign policy makes me wonder, right, to what extent there is no sort of audience cost. How is that going to affect our relations in the region? But overall, I'll conclude by saying, we're still in the hypothetical world and it's hard to make predictions, but I could see, how this election is going to lead to some change, regardless of who wins.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaplan. And as you have all heard, these interventions are very, very rich, very stimulating, and really we have to refrain from commenting upon this. I was just wondering whether I could highlight two elements, because this will help me to introduce the next guest, the next speaker. One is the debate on whether the US, to what extent the US is pivoting to Asia and to what extent is actually disengaging from the Middle East and Europe as well. But the other element is this tension between the White House and the Pentagon. I think somehow is related to US foreign policy towards Russia. We could see quite a lot of that, in the sense that from Obama to Trump, we could see some differences in the way the two presidents interacted with Russia compared to other institutions within the US government. So without any further delay, I'm going to introduce one of our in-house experts for today's debate, Dr. Ruth Dermond, who is from the Department of World Studies of King's College London, of course. She's the co-convener of the Russian and Eurasian Security Research Group. Her current research focuses on Russian foreign policy, particularly towards the post-Soviet space, and on the post-Cold War relationship between the United States and Russia. Dr. Dermond, thank you for joining us. You have up to 15 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organising such a fascinating panel. So I want to talk about Russia and European security and the implications for both of the current US election. So I'll start by saying that, I'm, as far as I can tell, I think it's most likely that neither of these things are going to be the top foreign policy priority after the election, whoever wins. But both will be important for the US, and the US will continue to be central to both, not least because the relationship between the US and Russia will continue to shape the wider security environment. There's a second general point to make, is that I don't see any broad improvement in US-Russia relations, whoever wins. I don't think that that's remotely likely. But perhaps surprisingly, I think we can potentially see more positives in a Biden presidency for the US-Russia relationship. As I say, unlikely as that may sound, even though the relationship between the two presidents will be worse, and the relationship is likely to become more confrontational in many areas. The second point in that regard I would make is that I think a Biden presidency would unquestionably improve European security. Before I turn to specifics, kind of another caveat really, which is, and I think this is something that Dr. Kaplan also touched on, that one of the few constants in US foreign policy, it seems to me, is the way that assumptions about the foreign policy priorities of incoming administrations gets diverted by events. That actually what we think of at the start of a new presidential administration as being the most likely kind of foreign policy path doesn't always turn out that way. And that's clearly been true in the case of Trump and Russia, I have to say. So the US-Russia relationship is a kind of curious one in many respects. And one of the reasons why I think it's so unstable historically since the early 1990s is because it's an extremely narrow relationship. If you compare it to the relationship that other powerful states typically have with each other, there are really very few issues that are significant in the US-Russia relationship that kind of dominate the agenda. And all of those are what realists would refer to as high politics, right? Arms control, international security, the management of international security institutions, balance of power, all these kinds of things are on the agenda, I think, in the US-Russia relationship. And other things really are not so much, except in some administrations, questions around democracy. But I think one of the things that means is that the range of subjects on the agenda will be very limited, whoever wins, right? In terms of where either new president or new administration would be starting from, the US-Russia relationship under Trump has not turned out, I think, the way that the Russian government anticipated. I don't think they expected Trump to win, but they were clearly pleased when he did, not least because Putin and Hillary Clinton famously do not have a good personal relationship. But the Russian government hasn't got what it wanted or expected from the Trump presidency by and large. And I've seen quite a lot of comments in recent weeks from in the media and elsewhere from other commentators about the idea that actually a Trump presidency has been beneficial for Russia, that that Russia has managed to achieve what it wanted. In other words, the destabilization of American domestic politics and the reduction of America's influence and image abroad. While I think obviously both those things are beneficial for the Russian government, actually the things that were top of its agenda at the start of the Trump presidency simply haven't cashed out, haven't come to pass. The most important of those, I think, was some kind of reduction in tension over Ukraine, and in particular, a reduction of sanctions. Obviously, that hasn't happened. Not only has there not been a reduction of tension over Ukraine, but and something I'm sure that the Russian government didn't expect, you actually had the Trump administration providing military aid in the forms of equipment to the Ukrainian government. And not only did you not have a lifting of the sanctions, but sanctions were extended to cover in response to other issues, particularly the Skripal poisoning in the UK, but also Congress locked sanctions in through legislation. So even had the Trump administration wanted to lift sanctions that had been imposed, they couldn't have done so. There was also talk at the start of the administration and before about a potential cooperation or at least accommodation in the Middle East in respect of dealing with Islamist terrorism. That clearly hasn't happened. And of course, you have events including the killing of Russian soldiers, if not official Russian troops, by Americans in Syria, right? Which hasn't been tremendously positive for either party. There's been no general improvement in the relationship of the kind that was expected. So although, as I say, we've seen a destabilization of NATO, a reduction in US credibility, and near total silence from the Trump administration on democracy and human rights in Russia, all of which were very welcome and are regarded, I guess, as wins by the Russian government. On the other hand, its priorities haven't been, and expectations haven't been met. And at the same time, the Trump administration has presented a lot of problems for Russia. The dismantling of the arms control regime, which is very important for Russia in lots of ways. Trump personally seems very focused on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which he seems to take quite personally, actually, is very opposed to it. As I said, there have been an increase in sanctions, and then actually, I think the general destabilization of the international security environment has not been that helpful for Russia. I think the Russian government don't particularly want to, get up in the morning not knowing whether the US president has decided to start, nuclear war with North Korea, for example. So, I mean, this is the situation that the US-Russia relationship is in, and as is the case with, I think, every single US administration since the end of the Cold War, at the end of the administration, relations are in the worst position, US-Russia relations are in the worst position that they've been since the mid-1980s. At the end of every US administration, US-Russia relations end up worse than at the end of the previous one. In terms of what's likely to come, I mean, certainly the Russian government are now giving out signs, I think, that they expect Biden to win. We can see this in the recent, this week, refusal to engage on the Hunter Biden stories, which Putin conducted when he was asked about, and the kind of careful maneuvering around the much desired renegotiation of New START. I think, looking at the two possible outcomes of the election, right? If Biden wins, one of the things that is central to the US-Russia relationship is the extent to which the two presidents can get on with each other. I think because of this, the nature of the relationship, the nature of the agenda, a lot has to happen at presidential level. And it seems pretty unlikely that Biden and Putin are going to get on, because of their prior history, because of Russia's role in the 2016 elections, because of Russia's role in the Hunter Biden disinformation issue. But on the other hand, I think a more stable and, I have to say, a more competent US national security and foreign policy team may help to smooth things out. And, I think one of the most significant areas of US-Russia relations in a Biden presidency, and one of the things that actually will help to improve the relationship, at least in this area, is the commitment to arms control. So Biden has spoken about on many occasions, the need to restore and repair nuclear arms control. And so this is actually something that the US and Russia can agree on in a Biden presidency. Beyond that, it's hard to see relations improving at all. And as I say, at a presidential level, they're much more likely to get worse than they are to improve. On European security, I think clearly Biden has made it clear that he wants to repair alliances, including repair the relationship with NATO. And this would certainly be a source of friction with Russia. Another significant source of friction with Russia would be the Biden commitment to placing the idea of democracy at the center of US foreign policy thinking, though, of course, as previous speakers have noted, this may turn out to be more limited in practice than in theory. But because of that commitment, I think it would be much harder for a Biden government, a Biden administration, to ignore events in Russia, like the Navalny poisoning, and indeed elsewhere in the post-Soviet space, for example, in Belarus at the moment. And so that, I think, would likely become an additional source of antagonism, as it did during the Obama administration. If Trump wins, great difference.
Dr. Damon, I'm really sorry to say that we have lost you there. Yes, can you hear us?
Yes, sorry about that. I have no idea what happened.
Okay, sorry, I'll let you conclude, sorry.
Sorry. So I'm not quite sure where I cut out, but to go back, I think if Trump wins, we're going to see more of the same, as we saw in his first term, but that will in itself move things in the direction of greater instability. And that will include, I think, continued incoherence in the relationship with Russia, as in other areas of foreign policy, because advisors are not selected for policy consistency, but for loyalty. And that's been perhaps more strikingly true on Russia than in other areas. And because, and again, I think Dr. Kaplan noted this, the divergence between the White House and the State Department on areas, and sometimes between Trump and his own White House officials, his national security advisor, for instance. That divergence on Russia has created substantial incoherence, and I think that will continue. Then, of course, Congress, I think, will continue to block any attempt to improve relations should Trump be re-elected. And that will be true, I think, not just amongst Democrats, but certainly in the Senate. Republican senators have taken just as kind of negative a view about the US-Russia relationship as their Democrat counterparts. Trump is not committed to renewing the arms control regime in contrast, or sorry, instead he's, I think, committed to expanding and modernizing the US nuclear capability, and really not interested in a New START treaty or anything like it, unless it involves China, which is hard to envisage. And then, Trump's negative approach to NATO is going to continue to be a major threat to international security. So although it will be an area on which Russia and Trump will continue to share interests to some extent, certainly, neither of them favor NATO. That rejection of the NATO alliance, that moving away from the NATO alliance, I think is likely to be the most significant factor challenging security in Europe if Trump is re-elected, because it will hugely increase insecurity and uncertainty amongst other NATO members. And this, I think, creates the potential for misperception, miscalculation on the part of Russia, for example. But it also, of course, will encourage, I think, potentially NATO states to seek other forms of security, to start engaging in a kind of security entrepreneurialism outside NATO, which would in itself be destabilizing. So to conclude, I don't really see a great deal of positivity. Whoever wins the election, there's not going to be a dramatic reset. The only really significant positive area I can see would be the development of a new kind of arms control dialogue under Biden. But beyond that, I think, as I say, whoever wins, the US-Russia relationship is going to be very negative for the foreseeable future. And that will have consequences for the security of the rest of the European continent.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dermont. And you said the Kremlin was happy about Trump's victory, but it hasn't got what it wanted. And what I infer from this is that there's an issue between discourse and reality. I think at times Trump is consistent with his discourse, at times he isn't. That's, I guess, the challenge of trying to make sense of US grand strategy at this time in history. And on this note, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Sir Lawrence Freedman, who has been professor of war studies at King's College London since 1982. He was later awarded the Commander of the British Empire Honour for exactly 1996, and was appointed official historian of the Falklands campaign in 1997. In June 2009, Professor Freedman was appointed to serve as a member of the official inquiry into Britain's intervention in the 2003 Iraq War. Professor Freedman, welcome. Thanks for joining us. And the floor is yours for no more than 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much. First, sort of apologies to the rest of the panel, because we had a rather exciting drive here, got stuck behind an accident, and our electricity is not working properly. So I shall have to do my bit and then leave you. So what I'd like to do is talk about the implications of what I assume to be a Biden victory for the UK. I think we need to give it a bit of context to go back even before Trump as to how the UK relationship with the US has been developing over the last decade or so. People talk about a special relationship. Next year we'll be celebrating 80 years since the Atlantic Charter, when Roosevelt and Churchill met and really established this relationship that has endured since then. And the point about the US-UK relationship and why it has been distinctive is not only the many special types of relationships in terms of intelligence, nuclear weapons, working on NATO and so on, but they've always had a sort of common project. The defeat of Nazism was the first common project, then briefly the defeat of Japan, then setting the terms for the Cold War, the UK putting an enormous effort to bring the US into European security, the conduct of the Cold War, going right up to the end of the Cold War, and then shaping the post-war order. The UK and US worked together after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990. There was a stormy period actually between the two countries over the Balkans, but then again they started to work together. There was always a common project. And in 2001, you got what seemed to be the ultimate common project after the attack on New York and Washington by Al-Qaeda, when the United States and the UK became sort of coalition partners in the war on terror. And Blair not only was very involved in Afghanistan, but particularly as sort of a cheerleader for the war with Iraq in 2003 and the occupation. So you've had the special relationship is very easily mischaracterized, all about particular influence of the UK or getting favours and so on. It has actually, to me, always been about these shared projects based on a shared mindset, which comes from both being maritime powers, the UK having sort of handed over to the US over the course of the early decades of the 20th century, but taking similar lines on the importance of open trade, on the importance of liberal norms, and you can argue all the times in which these have been dishonoured, but the themes were there and the projects were there. It isn't simply about who gets to be the first to visit to Washington after election or who has special influence. All of that started to decline, I would say, for two reasons. First, the end of the problems that we faced in Afghanistan and Iraq. Secondly, the financial crisis. So the sort of interventionist urge, which Blair championed during the 1990s, was soured by the experience of the insurgencies in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then you combine that with the financial crisis, which sort of soured the impulses of globalization, the sense that the free market economies really had the clue to how to do things. And then when you couple that with the rise of China and the possibilities of a sort of authoritarian economics, then there's been a challenge to the relationship building up really from the end of the Bush years through the Obama years. Now, Trump and Brexit were seen as two sides of the same coin in 2016. I think actually that's misleading. I think they're very different origins, but Trump certainly appeared as a fan of Brexit. And in both cases, it was seen as countries, sort of the two countries that had in some ways led the way into the post-Second World War order, had helped define the terms of the New World Order after the end of the Cold War, turning away from their creations. The UK had been a sort of inveterate multilateralist and had to work hard to get into what was then the common market, and now was settling itself away from its European partners, while Trump's whole ideology was distrustful of multilateral institutions, particularly distrustful of NATO, and certainly not a fan of free trade. But so there wasn't a common project because Trump didn't have any projects that were of interest to the UK or other European partners. To the extent that there was one, and one which may continue under Biden, it's much more about China and the UK's. I think there are things the UK can do and wants to do about China. It's got the issues of Hong Kong and so on, but its contribution is always going to be limited. Whereas if you're talking about questions of the of Europe and the Middle East, there's a lot that can be done. So there isn't a common project. That's the starting point. To the extent that the UK does have foreign policy priorities, they haven't actually been the same as Trump's. However much people may see the two looking close, they're not close. There's three big issues where they've diverged. The first has been the first was the movement of the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. The second was the Paris Agreement on climate change. The third was the Iran, was GCPOA. And on all of those, the UK, under May, but when Johnson was foreign minister, worked with France and Germany. It wasn't following the American lead. So that was always there, and that's one reason why there's going to the idea that somehow Trump losing is bad news for the UK is not the case. The alignment of foreign policy will then be pretty good. on climate change, on Iran, on looking after NATO, on even on the trade issues that we'll come to in a second. There's nothing particularly that Trump has got to offer there, and much that causes difficulty. Moreover, I think this tends to get overlooked in some of the conversations on these issues. Although people will say that Johnson in some of his practices follows Trump, he really doesn't go as far. And the sort of dystopian image of the decline of democracy, which Trump has offered, this continual violations of the rule of law, beyond anything that Johnson has even attempted. All of these things provide reasons why, you can certainly see in terms of polls of the British people, there would be relief if somebody who was calm and worked within the mainstream came along. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there aren't issues. One of the issues, there's a lot of people around Biden don't like Johnson. He made disobliging remarks, about racist remark, basically, about Obama. They see him as being a European Trump, even if he isn't quite a European Trump. So it's not going to be an easy and warm relationship. In that sense, though, Biden isn't one actually as a personality who bears grudges. And in that sense, he's quite an open politician. I'm sure he'll be fine talking to Johnson, but nonetheless, there's a problem. But beyond that, I think you have to recognise that there's quite a lot that the US and the UK do with one another. So in the coming year, in 2021, the UK is chair of the Group of Seven. So they'll be working closely with the Americans on that. There's the big climate change conference in Glasgow in a year's time. That is important for both Johnson and Biden's agendas. There's the continual work together on intelligence, which has been damaged under the Trump years, but will hopefully start to move together. There's, and also if you just look at UK defence capabilities and see what happens with the integrated review, they're incredibly intertwined with the US now. The UK carriers are now geared for American F-35 squadrons as well as UK. American Marines have been on them. There's a lot that just naturally the two countries do together. But there still isn't a common project, and it's still, to the extent there is one, it's China, or there's Russia, Turkey, but these are issues where the UK hasn't led over the last few years before Brexit. So it's not clear exactly what on this sort of immediate foreign policy issues where strategies have got to be developed, whether the UK will have a lot to contribute on those, and that I think will be the challenge. Finally, let me say a bit about the trade question. So the assumption has been that, and this was said almost as soon as Trump was elected, well, this is good because Trump's positive towards the UK, we'll get a good trade deal post-Brexit. Well, there was always one problem with that, which was that Trump isn't a great free trader, and the things that he would want and do want are actually quite difficult for the UK provide. Access to the health service, the famous problem with production of chickens. Secondly, it needs the House. People talk as if the free trade agreements are in the president's gift. They're not. They have to be approved by the House of Representatives. And as soon as Trump lost the House in the second term, after 2 years, the Democrats were going to have a say on that. We've already seen the issue of the Good Friday Agreement and the importance of violence. So whoever wins, that you've got a problem with trade. Actually, in some ways, I think you could have a better trade deal with Biden. It's just not going to be Biden's priority. Trade generally isn't going to be his priority. So I would say that there's quite a lot of work that's gone on it, that they may carry it on. It's actually easier, whatever is said about priorities, for a deal to be done with the UK rather than the EU, because there's so many partners involved with the EU. So an EU trade deal, which was in trouble even before Trump came to power, is still going to be difficult. There's also the question of how the UK fits in with the Pacific trade agreement, which is separate from Biden, because Trump pulled away from that. But the UK is discussing whether it could join that. So I think actually there's quite a bit that could be done on trade. You just have to come back to the problem that Biden has got quite traditional democratic wariness about pushing trade agendas, still dependent upon on union votes and so on. But if you have a Democrat House, a Democrat president, and a Democrat Senate, in some ways it becomes easier to do that. So I think that is a difficulty, is overrated, or at least it's a difficulty whoever wins the election. So my overall sense is that it's going to be a little difficult and rocky to start with, but eventually the basic relationship between the two countries kicks in. And we've been here before. In 1990, that there was concern that Bush was more interested in Germany than the UK. Then the Gulf conflict came along, and the British were the ones that were most useful on that occasion. Clinton, in 1992, when he won, had good reasons to be irritated with the Major government, because Major had been helping Bush try and find some dirt on Clinton. That was a rocky time. So we've been here before. My sense is that the core relationship will continue, but my basic point, it's not clear what the core relationship is about so much when the two countries haven't got something to get their teeth into as the major foreign policy project. That may change, but that will depend on events. And perhaps that's the thing always to say at the end of any discussion like this, a lot depends on events. Final point, I've been assuming all the way that Biden will win. All I would say is the circumstances in which Trump would remain president would probably be incredibly damaging to democracy, because unless the pollsters are wrong beyond ways in which they've ever been wrong before, the only way Trump wins the election is by relying on the Supreme Court, which I don't think is a healthy way to do it. So I think if that happens, we're in real trouble, and I don't think the UK would be able to sustain a warm and healthy relationship with the new president, with Trump as continuing as president in those circumstances. And I would add that being adrift from the EU in those circumstances would not be particularly comfortable otherwise. But if Biden wins, I think we'll cope. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Freedman. Since, as you said, you're about to leave us because of those technical issues, I was wondering whether I could make a brief question, or if you really need to go on.
Sure.
All right, so maybe it's a question that helps summarizing your intervention. From a point of view, you mentioned that Britain, the US, they effectively have been to liberal empires, to maritime powers. And so I was wondering if nowadays to you, this kind of old-fashioned grand geopolitical narratives about a clash between a liberal maritime and Anglo-American union against a more kind of Eurasian bloc. Do they make sense at all nowadays to you? Maybe they're too black and white, given the kind of picture that you've given to us.
I'm not sure I heard all of that properly, but I think the UK and the US can talk the same language on a lot of these issues. I think the big question, and Ruth already talked about sort of the authoritarianism of Russia and how you deal with that, and I agree with what she said. The big question is going to be China. And I think, I mean, having listened recently to some Europeans talking about China policy, I think there's going to be quite a bit of tension, because I think the Anglo-Saxon approach, which I would put Canada, Australia in as well, is to be pretty wary now of China for its authoritarianism, accepting that there are a lot of big economic issues which give us no choice but to deal with China. I don't think Biden is going to be as belligerent in his rhetoric, but he's certainly going to be wary of China. And I think within the EU, there's a sort of concern that there's too much of this sort of grand Manichaean conflict between the sort of Thucydidean moment between China and the US, and we're talking up the risks of great power conflict when in fact we should be calming them down. I suspect the UK may find itself agreeing a little bit more with the US, that you don't have to go that far, but you certainly have to recognize that China has got a very clear geopolitical project, and that's challenging in a number of ways for the liberal democracies, not least in the fact that they don't like any criticism for their illiberalism. So I think diplomatically, this could be quite important. And of course, you know, the carriers are going to spend time in the Pacific and do freedom of navigation exercises, but there's limits on what the UK can do in Asia Pacific region. So I think I think rhetorically we'll fall in behind, but I'm not quite sure whether we're going to be doing much more than that.
Professor Freedman, thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thanks for
Sorry
joining
not
us.
to spend more time
Thank
with
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. I hope so, yes. And last but not least, or if you want, dulcis in fundo, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Leila Simona Talani, expert in international political economy from the Department of European and International Studies of King's College London. She was appointed as Jean Monnet Chair of European Political Economy by the European Commission in 2012. And in 2017, she was awarded a visiting professorship at the Kennedy School of Government of the University of Harvard. Professor Talani, thank you very much for your time today. Thanks for joining us. You have up to 15 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I have up to 15 minutes, but I think I'll use less because I'm not, as you know, I'm not an expert on international security. So what I'll be talking today is the impact of the elections on the international political economy, which has been a political economist for me is the same. So there is a big difference. Or to be honest, and let's be a little bit less strong, I believe that they're very much connected. So if you want to see what the reality is of the impact of the new administration, US administration on the IP, you have to look more or less at the same areas that we have been talking until now, and most notably COVID, because it's an international political economy issue, very much so, and I'll elaborate on this. China, as you can imagine, and also to a certain extent, but just to complement the discussion which has been going on until now, the Middle East, just to reiterate similar points which have been made by my colleagues previously. So what do I want to say? First of all, the big specter in the room here is obviously COVID-19. So what is going to happen if one or the other win the election? In terms of political economy, the international political economy, I actually believe it's not going to be a huge difference. There is a lot of rhetoric by the two opposed candidates on how they are dealing with COVID, which are actually two opposed ways of dealing with COVID, which I think is done to capture different sections of the electorate. But in practice, in political economy terms, I think the strategy will be exactly the same, which is the one which has been implemented until now, most obviously to intervene heavily in the economy. I mean, very recently, I think yesterday, Trump signed 2.2 trillion actually recovery intervention for the US economy, which was voted bipartisanly by the Congress and by the Senate. So there has been no difference whatsoever. And this is the obvious thing to do. It's not that there can be differences in this situation. In this kind of situation, you just have to intervene heavily in supporting the economy by providing as much funds as possible. And 2.2 trillion of dollars is a lot of money if you consider that the recovery fund for the EU is only 209 billion euros. So it's really much less, and it's actually not comparable to what the US can do. In this, obviously, the US are very much helped by the fact that the dollar is still the most important reserve currency in the world. And so basically, obviously, in this context, in this political economy context, there are never going to be any inflationary problems. But even if there were, this is not going to happen when you are the reserve currency of the world. So this is another IP element, is how the US can afford incurring such a huge debt. The reason is because they are the reserve currency of the world, and someone who will take the dollars if they are producing excess, there will always be someone who is funding the US, who is taking the treasury bills, who is investing in US treasury bills. So that's one of the points. So whoever wins, I don't think this is going to be different. I don't think there's going to be any change in the real political economy approach to the resolution of the COVID-19 crisis, despite the complete rhetorical differences that exist between the two candidates, especially during the electoral campaign. The other important, the other aspect which I wanted to elaborate upon is the relation with China. And here again, I think I agree with the majority of my colleagues that there is not going to be a huge difference between the two. I mean, after all, the discussion we had here today on all different aspects, it seems clear that there aren't huge differences between the two, according to whoever wins the elections. And this is the same for the political economy relation with China. Why? I mean, obviously the rhetoric can change slightly between the two, but the reality is that there is a big issue here, which is the technological war. Technological war is the future for the world, for the international political economy. And the technological war has already started with the Trump, when obviously he had to stop Huawei from providing infrastructure for the 5G in the US. And this is the first time that there is a competitor in technological provision to the US. So the biggest provider for 5G infrastructure is actually precisely China. Huawei and ZTE. So these are the two companies which provide, I think, is around 40% of the infrastructure for the 5G. And this is, and that is the first time, I think, in history that the US is second in this kind of technological provision. And this is a bit worrying, to be honest, because the technological war is actually the future. Nothing else is going to be more important than this. And here is where economic diplomacy makes no big difference, because here you really need to be at the forefront of the war. So you really need to be the one who is winning the war. So economic diplomacy wouldn't make any difference from this point of view. This is my opinion. And I really seriously doubt that Biden will change idea. So I don't think that the administration by Biden would actually open trade on technology to China, would reverse the decision not to use Huawei's provision and ZTE provision of the 5G. infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So here again, I think that the situation is exactly the same between the two, considering also that combining this aspect of technology in COVID-19 after or even during the COVID-19 crisis, technology has become, as we can all see by using Zoom, incredibly more important in general, and is also going to change substantially, I think, where the previous processes of globalization. There is some people talking about deglobalization, which is a very strange word, because deglobalization cannot really actually happen, but there can be new, this is my opinion, but there can be, and I can explain if you want in a question later, but what can happen, and is actually already happening, is that there be trends towards a sort of relocalization within globalization, especially with the shortening of the global value chains. And the shortening of the global value chains is going to happen not only because of the COVID-19 crisis, which helps a lot, but also because technology now makes it possible to produce cost effectively, again, in a more narrow geographical location. And this is possible because of the 3D printers, artificial intelligence, and other new methodology of production that allow for a relocalization of production or some kind of shortening of the global value chains. So all of this is going to make a change, but it's completely independent from who wins the elections, whether it's Biden or Trump, because none of the two can afford doing anything too different from what the other would do in relations to both China and technology. And finally, and I want to conclude here because I have only a certain number of issues to discuss. What will happen in the relation with the Middle East is interesting, because I tendentially believe that most of the American, I'm gonna be provoking here, especially in the context of international security, but most of the intervention of the US in the Middle East has been somehow related to oil. And because oil is becoming a much less salient issue for the US for reasons relating to both the fact that now the US is actually completely independent from production of oil abroad, but also because there is a new technological change that allows for the use of more electric energy and non-oil based means of communication and so on. That and all of the discussion about the new energies, the new way of producing energy and so on. I don't really believe that the Middle East is going to be an issue in the future, or at least as silent an issue as it used to be before, precisely because the US doesn't really need to intervene from the economic point of view, from the political economy point of view in the Middle East. And that also explains to a certain extent why there has been a withdrawal of interest of the US from the area more recently. And I still don't believe that there will be a huge difference between the two candidates, how they will approach the Middle East, precisely because of the political economy reasons that I was underlined before. So that would be my intervention in this context.
Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers. Thank you for setting the scene. Thank you for explaining our over there, and then for taking us literally around the world, touching upon Russia, touching upon China, touching upon issues of political economy, touching upon U.S. grand strategy, foreign policy in the Middle East and elsewhere. Team, so before we actually hand it over to the Q&A, and by the way, please do use the Q&A box, the Q&A function, write down your question and I will be reading that aloud. Okay, so I mean, just to speed up the process. Unfortunately, we only have 40 more minutes. But before we do that, I would like to hand it over to our colleagues for any immediate questions to each other. If there are, please, dear colleagues, just unmute yourself and just if you have something that you would like to tease out a little further, please, obviously the floor is yours.
So can I jump in?
Sure.
Please, Bruce. Thank you.
I just wanted to respond to a question that that Ken Schultz posed at the start, which is where the Europeans will want to see a kind of restoration of the relationship with the US, even if Biden is elected, you know, whether they will re-embrace the country that elected George W. Bush and Trump. And I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, that's from my perspective, not least because the US is not the only country to have kind of gone down that path and attempt perhaps to be turning away from it, but also because, you know, NATO continues to be absolutely critical for European security. And so, you know, the relationship with the US is vital for European security going into the future. If, as he said he would, Biden is committed to kind of restoring the relationship with you know, in NATO and with other alliances, then yeah, absolutely. I can't imagine that Germany or France or you know, certainly not the UK are going to want to you know, continue to see the relationship fracture with the US. So that was my thought.
Thank you.
Thank you. I thank you very much, Ruth, for this. Well, I mean, Dr. Kaplan, I think that here there's a very, very interesting question for you here in the chat. It is fairly provocative, probably. The student is asking if you think that given everything that is happening in the United States, if the country is actually becoming a failed state, even though all the unrest might not necessarily result in civil war, do you think we will continue to see a multitude of events akin to civil unrest, no matter who wins the race for the White House?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's certainly a provocative one. You know, first I'll say no. I don't think the United States is a failed state, but I think the instinct to think about the normalization and continuation of low-level violence in the United States, especially around electoral violence, you know, is reasonable. In many ways, we've already seen election-related violence here in the United States, the kind of openness of right-wing militias. It's real. And, you know, I think if you talk to many Americans, there is this general sense of this feeling that there is this threat of violence that is, you know, again, like the question says, not civil war level, not failed state level, but nonetheless, right, we are a country with extremely heated politics right now, where we also have a lot of guns and a lot of a kind of sense where I think people from a human security perspective, right, don't always see the state as much as they used to as the kind of legitimate actor that is responsible for protecting them. And I think that's actually going to be one of the biggest challenges, you know, for a Biden administration, if it does succeed, is reconvincing the American people that the federal government or the state government, the government is has a response, still has, you know, the means and desire by which to ensure everyone's safety. But you know, it's possible. I mean, read an article today in Foreign Affairs that made a very good, you know, argument for the case that we could see kind of low-level violence continue. But I have high hopes that we can rise above that and that it will not turn into something more systematic and long-term. But right now, it certainly doesn't look great.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Kaplan. Professor Schultz, Ken, actually, we have two questions for you. Obviously, I will be more than happy to restate, to repeat the second one if we lose it. But the first one from Femi is the following one. How will President Trump advance his agenda if he wins the elections, but loses the majority in both the houses of the Senate? Do you think that this will have an impact on what he wants to do? And the other one is, will a Biden relationship take the leash off the national security professionals and let them work independently on the White House?
Great, thank you. Thank you for both of those questions. So with respect to the first question, if Trump gets reelected, but one or both chambers of Congress are held by Democrats. The most likely thing that we're going to see is that Trump is going to try to advance his agenda through unilateral executive powers. And that has been the growing trend in the United States for quite some time now. And even Obama, when he was president, resorted quite frequently to the use of executive orders for domestic policies and executive agreements when making agreements with other states. So both the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal were conducted as executive agreements precisely, well, in part to avoid the issues of ratification that might have been difficult through Congress. So Trump has continued that pattern of engaging in executive orders. You know, the nature of the US political system is that there just has been this concentration of power in the executive that gives the president a great deal of ability to sidestep constraints from Congress. So that would almost certainly be his strategy. There may be limits to that strategy, but even in his first term, he's proven remarkably willing and able to slip congressional constraints, and I would expect that to continue. And of course, when we worry about the kind of erosion of the quality of democracy in the United States, there's lots of things that we worry about, but the increasing concentration of executive power is one of them. The second question was about Biden and the national security professionals. Did I get that right?
That's right.
Yeah, well, I would second what Morgan said about this. I think one of the things that we have seen over the course of the first Trump term has been kind of the gradual replacement of professionals chosen for expertise with loyalists, and which has placed the whole national security apparatus under much closer control of the president when he chooses to engage with it. And we've seen the kind of standard national security decision-making processes have largely been, short-circuited. I would expect Biden to try to restore those processes. There's reasons those processes are in place because they may prevent you from doing stupid or rash things. And I suspect he would move back to elevating expertise and professionalism. Now, of course, he's going to want political allies too in these positions. So it's as all presidents do. But I think there'll be a rebalancing back towards more professionalization would be my guess.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ken, for amazing comments. Professor Talani, we also have two questions for you. I know that you have mentioned deglobalization and you're pretty critical of the concept, but one student asks, do you think that COVID-19 will cause an indefinite shift towards deglobalization? And the second one is actually about Trump and China. Apologies. It is about China. And the question goes, will Biden, if he wins, reverse the Chinese trade tariffs put in place by Trump, or will he continue to the pattern of belligerence with China on trade, given China's intellectual property theft and trade malpractice?
Thank you, Michele. So I'm not really critical of the term deglobalization. It all depends on how you define globalization. So it really depends on what you mean by globalization. So I'm not going to enter a discussion on the different approaches that exist, but you can have a very quantitative approach, which means only calculating or measuring the differences, the increases in the various phenomena which represent globalization, like FDIs, increase in FDIs, mergers and acquisition, transactions, financial transactions, trade flows, and so on. Or you can have a more qualitative one, which is based on the kind of technological changes that made it possible for the new modes of production to happen, basically. So the fact that you now can produce globally at a profit is not something which has made possible by the latest or the technological changes that happened in the last 40 years. Before it was not possible. It wouldn't make any sense. It's not that people who can be considered normal if they were producing in Bangladesh and then assembling something in Portugal, if it is not made possible by technological means and actually reductions in the cost of communication and in the cost of transport. So that is what globalization would be for me. And it means also that there can be different stages of globalization. So there could be a new stage of globalization where you have new technologies which allow for a different allocation of resources, and also, according to me, thanks to a certain extent to COVID, a relocation of some of those production and some of those activities and even some of those services. So it is possible, because it will make more economic sense. And say it in a nutshell, it will simply cost less to produce closer to home than to produce in China, so because of the existence of new methodology of production, like 3D printers. Is my, the typical example I give to my students. If you can produce, I don't know, a cup in your own lounge room, spending little money, why do you want to produce it in China? It's much easier to do it at home. So, and that is actually possible now. 3D printers can do all kinds of things, and all kinds of things which I'm not going to elaborate on now. So it's a different form of globalization, if you want, which we can even call a deglobalization, but it really is not related to the measurement of flows. Is related to the modalities of production and technology that allow you to produce in a completely different way. Why COVID helped? Because COVID made it possible to understand that we were already able to do it, and it could, and it actually to a certain extent made the entire world do it, because there was no other option. And so once you have started this process, it's very unlikely that it will stop, like home working, all of these other, and so there will be structural changes because of COVID-19, coupled with the new technologies that are able to produce new activities and new modes of production. So that would be my answer. Yes, COVID-19 is actually facilitating trends which would have already happened, but maybe slow to a slower pace. That would be my answer. And for China, I really don't see how Biden can release, release China from all the tariff imposed, especially for something which I don't necessarily like to call economic diplomacy reasons. If there is going to be a tough position of the US towards China, this is going to be maintained by any administrations. And this is very much related to what I have underlined before, the existence of a clear technology war between the two. And this is the only two countries we can actually compete in this technology war at this, more or less at the same level. Not really at the same level. I mean, I think China is still not close to the possibilities, the abilities of the US in this realm, but they are at least threatening the US, whereas I don't see where Europe can come into this, which is one of the most important problems of Europe. Europe is not into the war, a technological war at all. It's just, taking some, it's just a receiver of technology. It's not at the forefront, which is a serious problem for Europe. It will be even more in the future. I think the UK understood this. For especially financial innovation, and the UK wants to be at the forefront of technological advancement for especially for financial innovation, but the rest of Europe is really lagging behind, with even Germany, which one wouldn't expect. But I think that would be my answer. So neither Biden nor Trump can afford having a different attitude towards trade with China at the moment for economic diplomacy reasons. Yeah.
Many thanks, dear Professor. Thank you very much, Dr. Diamond. I know that you haven't really touched upon the issue of the matter of Iran much, right? So especially in terms of Russian relationship with Tehran. Nevertheless, I think that here there's a very interesting question, and it goes: is there a possibility for a war with Iran given Trump is re-elected? And let me just add, what would the role, hypothetically, that the Kremlin, that Russia would play in this? Thank you.
That's an interesting question, rather alarming question. I mean, I would defer to Dr. Kaplan on the question of a possibility of war with Iran. I mean, I think if it were to happen, and I struggle to see that that's likely, but you know, it's not so much my area. But if it were to happen, then I can't imagine that Russia would want to get involved. I mean, you know, one thing that we've seen is that the Russian government has been quite careful to avoid the possibility of actually getting involved in a conflict with the US. And we can see it, I referred to this briefly when I was talking earlier, that in Syria, there was an incident at the start of last year, I think, possibly the year before, when US forces ended up killing quite a large number of Russians. They weren't Russian regular forces, they were members of the Wagner group, the mercenaries, essentially. But what you saw there was a profound unwillingness on both sides, actually, Russian and American, to escalate it. There was a clear kind of de-escalation of the situation. Nobody wanted to talk about how many people had died, or you know, or to do anything to further inflame the situation. So I really don't think that Russia would want to get involved. And I mean, the Russian government has more than enough to deal with at the moment anyway. You know, in Ukraine, in Belarus, still, you know, the situation with Turkey is kind of delicate, particularly around now the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. So no, I don't think it would be in their interests at all. May I just kind of quickly come back to an earlier question, because there was something that I wanted to say on that, if I can, very briefly. And this was a question about the effect of a situation in which Trump is re-elected and both houses of Congress are Democrat, because this is actually, I think, quite an important issue in the US-Russia relationship. The Russian government, I think, at a really fundamental level, doesn't fully accept that the US president is not in control of what happens in Congress, because that's not the way it works in Russia, right? And in particular, you know, the idea that members of Congress can say very rude things about Russia and take action to, you know, lock sanctions in, you know, to undermine any attempts to improve relations. That is almost always taken by the Russian government, not for what it actually is, but as a kind of underhand attempt by the US president to undermine what they claim they want to be doing. It will be even more of a problem, I have to say, if I think if Biden is elected and you have both houses of Congress that are Democrat, because then I don't think that there's any possibility that Putin will accept that the Democrats are not acting on the White House's orders if they, you know, take anti-Russian steps or make anti-Russian statements. So I think that's going to be a major kind of stumbling block. You know, even in areas where actually the White House might want to improve relations, and that failure of the Russian government to understand basically how American politics works has a very negative effect on the relationship.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Doctor. Really interesting point. Thank you, especially as it comes to Russia. that's very, very interesting. Dr. Kaplan, we actually have a number of questions for you. I'm just gonna try to see if we can fit them all. But the first one actually goes. Let me put it back. Oh, there we go. So right-wing militias grew about 800% under Obama. This is going to continue to grow regardless of who wins, though it will grow more under Biden. Kamala will be the target, obviously the student argues. Can this eventually be brought under control, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, for those who study the issues of militias in America, they're not new. They're certainly not new, right? I mean, they've existed for a long time. Certainly, it looks like there's been a proliferation of them. But you know, what's worth noting is it's about their activity, and the openness of the activity, I think, is really exceptionally new today. So I'll give you a personal example. I remember, I forget how many years ago the Charlottesville was, but it was the kind of like first incident where you really had, these right-wing militias coming out very publicly in ways that were quite unsettling for the 2010s. And, I remember I was talking to my friend and I said, oh my God, like, look at this. This is unreal. And he said, well, the good news is at least now we can see their faces. I said, actually, I don't think that's good news. I liked it better when we couldn't see their faces. And it gets to this point, right, about managing militias, which is, it's extremely hard to do under any context. And yes, even within the United States. The question is do these actors feel safe, right, being open? Do they feel safe parading around? Do they feel safe in their ability to actually act and make threats? And I think what's really scary about the US right now is that the answer is clearly yes, they feel safer than ever to operate publicly. And I think that whatever we have to do, it's going to be hard to eliminate these militias all the way down, but we have to at the very least create a situation in which they do not feel safe in spewing their hatred or in threatening people. They need to be put in a place where they're scared to engage in their activities. And so that's the kind of middle answer, which is very hard under any circumstance to root out armed non-state actors, but especially under certain laws here in the US. But they have to at the very least know that they're not in an environment where they can operate.
Thank you. I think we just. Oh, okay. Sorry, I froze for a second. Professor Schultz, we have here one question as for space politics. And so the student goes, as you know, the Trump administration recently created a division in the US Army for a space division as a new branch for future foreign policy. Where do you think this is going to go if Biden wins?
Well, that's a great question, and I wish I had a great answer. I mean, obviously, the issue of the Space Force has not been high on the radar screen in terms of the agenda. So it's a pretty low level issue. But I'll try to speculate anyway. So once bureaucratic agencies are created, they are almost impossible to get rid of. So there's a certain stickiness that's likely to kick in, such that it's going to hang around. So I think the bigger questions probably going forward are going to be what kind of levels of funding it actually gets, what kinds of activities it's allowed to engage in. But this is not going to be high on the priority list of a new Biden administration. So if action is taken, like the agenda would have to be driven by somebody else in Congress or within the Pentagon itself on what's going to happen with this. That's just my best guess about a topic that I just admit I don't know a lot about.
That's good. Thank you very much, Professor. Zeno, please go ahead if you have a question.
Sure. Okay. I'll go ahead. Waiting for the video to go back. It was just a very brief consideration. I mean, Professor Talani earlier on mentioned a couple of times this idea of deglobalization, and she actually said relocalization within globalization. From my perspective, from the perspective of somebody who studies geopolitics and grand strategies, every time I hear these words, it rings a bell to me, and it rings the bell of the concept of sphere of influence. So I just wanted to say that what she said earlier on, it's, I think, good food for thoughts when it comes to trying to making sense of this kind of old-fashioned concepts in the 21st century. So what does it mean, sphere of influence nowadays, and does it mean anything at all? It was just a brief consideration. It's something I keep thinking on. Thank you.
That's that's good, Zeno. Thank you. We have time, I think, for at least like one or two short questions / answers. The first one.
Can I answer? Do you mind? I wanted to answer.
Apologies, Professor. Absolutely, floor is yours.
Of course, I like the way he puts, as we are in two different disciplines, he calls them spheres of influence. We call them regionalization. And there is a lot of discussion on whether regionalization is a step towards globalization or is a way towards protectionism. And that, I think, is a dynamic relation there. So it's not a dialectic relation. To a certain extent is towards more globalization, however you want to define it, but to another extent is very much what you would call spheres of influence, is towards more, let's say, protectionist, not really protectionist, but at least more integrated relations within the clear regions. And that's a fact since always, basically. Since the beginning of globalization, you had regionalization. There is the famous triad, which is the most demonstrable with numbers. You have the Americas, Europe, and the Asia continent, more or less. So that is something which has always been the case, and you can discuss whether there's going to be more or less with COVID. I think more, if you want to say, be honest. I mean, I think it's going to be more, especially because there are many issues, first because of the deglobalization I was talking about, and second because there are issues at stake, like, for example, technology war. So it's going to be more for me personally. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I thank you very much, Professor. So, Professor Schultz, we started with you. I think we will be ending with you. And this one is actually pretty. It's a very interesting question. Let me walk you through. So, actually, it starts with an assumption, and it says, let's assume that Trump wins. Apologies, that Trump loses, but the administration calls for mail-in ballots, fraudulence, and then sends the election results to the Supreme Court, etc., etc. Would Democratic allies such as the EU or Canada be willing to call out and protest potentially against what the student calls undemocratic actions by the current administration? Or would they go along with the United States as the alliance is more important in the end? And would they not risk the relationships with the US if Trump is reelected again? I know it is pretty provocative, but I'm really wondering what you think about this. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating question that I hope remains entirely hypothetical. And to some extent, I would throw it to my British colleagues to speculate on what their government's response might be. So it's uncharted territory, which makes it very difficult to give a confident answer. And there's also different ways in which you could see this playing out. The issue that we face in the United States is that there's all these anti-democratic landmines sitting in our Constitution, such that we could achieve outcomes that strike us as not democratic, but which are nonetheless consistent with the Constitution, or at least original readings of the Constitution, which is going to create confusion about how illegitimate different outcomes could be. So, for example, if the election went to the House of Representatives and got decided according to these very obscure rules, not unprecedented in American history, it's provided for in the Constitution, it wouldn't be obviously illegitimate. There are other outcomes which might be more obviously so. And so typically, I mean, my speculation here, so a lot of it depends on how clearly the red lines are crossed, right? It's like, so whenever you think about it, do international actors respond to something? They're more likely to respond when situations are unambiguously bad. But if there's ambiguity or glosses of legitimacy, then that tends to make it harder to coordinate in opposition to it. So I think there's there's a continuum of how bad it could be. And I think a lot would depend on where we end up there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. Actually, I think that unfortunately we have to kind of end it here. I really apologize for those of you who did write in the box. So there are a number of very interesting questions on Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, India. Again, like Hunter's connections with China. Unfortunately, we don't have time to explore them. We're going to unfortunately let them hang there, but I'm pretty sure that things might become maybe a little clearer. Maybe, I don't know, hopefully next week. That said, huge thanks for this impressive effort. Thank you very much to our two technicians, Aisha and Lizzie, who put this together. Thank you very much, Zeno, for the event. And obviously, thank you to all of our students from all over the world. Thank you for hanging in with us on a Friday afternoon. Really, really appreciate it. And obviously, last but not least, thank you to each and every one of our panelists, of our guests, particularly from the United States, from California. Through from Harvard University, Dr. Kaplan, and then obviously to our distinguished colleagues from KCL, Professor Talani and Dr. Deyermon. Once again, a huge thanks, and hopefully, we're going to see each other again, maybe discussing the evolution of U.S. foreign policy once we have a president. Thank you very much, all, and take care and have a great night or rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's
Thank you
do
very
this in
much.
person sometime.